Good evening. I hope everybody is well. I'm Kellie Jones, and I chair our newly formed Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia. I'm speaking this evening on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape. I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future presence of Lenape on their homeland. Thank you in the audience for joining us today. In light of the changes in Harlem's landscape via gentrification and displacement, it was imperative that a department be established to attend to Harlem's resilient and changing community, participate in the fight for social justice, and advance the rich intellectual scholarship of the African diaspora and the multidisciplinary focus of the African American Studies discipline at Columbia University. In this vein, artists, community leaders, activists, educators, and researchers, and people from all walks of life have a space at AAADS to call their own. We offer events that foster collective engagement and spirited discourse on our community's most pressing issues, while contributing to national discourses on religion, sexuality, poverty, incarceration, politics, race, etc. We are embarking on an agenda to highlight and sustain the centrality of the arts in African American and African diaspora studies and its broader intellectual community. Look for programs with the artists in residence and our Black Arts dialogues and courses with our international scholar in residence and postdoctoral fellow, emphasizing music, creative writing, and visual arts. This is an exciting time of growth and opportunity for our department. I want to thank our co-sponsor, Columbia's Department of Art History and Archaeology. And as always, special thanks to Sharon Harris and Sean Mendoza for making this evening possible. And also to Mabel Wilson, who I'm stepping in for and pitching for, who is the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. I want to welcome you all to tonight's lecture, Smell Blood on WANGECHI MUTU and Global Contemporary Art by art historian and visiting professor Uchenna Itam. Dr. Uchenna Itam is an art historian and curator specializing in modern and contemporary art practices of the United States. Her research focuses on politics of identity and representation, as well as multisensory approaches to the aesthetic experience. As a founding member of the curatorial collective INGZ, Uchenna has presented exhibitions by artists LaToya Ruby Frazier, Kenya Robinson, and Mimi Cherono Ng'ok, among others. She has served as curator of the Henry Luce Foundation African American Collecting Initiative at the Archives of American Art, Smithsonian Institution. Uchenna holds a Ph.D. in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, an M.A. in the Humanities from the University of Chicago, and a B.A. in art history from the University of Pennsylvania. Tonight, Dr. Itam will present a talk titled Smell Blood on WANGECHI MUTU and Global Contemporary Art. This talk discusses the career of WANGECHI MUTU, born Kenya, 1972, from the 1990s to the present. Based in the United States amid burgeoning transnational contemporary art discourse, MUTU gained prominence for collage works on paper or mylar polyester film, depicting hybrid, racialized, and gendered figures in otherworldly landscapes. At the same time, the artist developed a signature installation practice of hammering walls, dripping fluids, and projecting performance-based videos. Beyond exploring the multisensory aesthetics of MUTU's site-specific interventions, this talk also reflects on the writing of African diaspora art history and criticism in the US at the turn of the 21st century. We will have time for Dr. Itam to respond to questions, so please remember to write these in the Q&A feature on this webinar. You can find the tab at the bottom right of the Zoom screen. Welcome, Uchenna Itam.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to present this lecture this evening. Thank you also to Mabel Wilson of the Institute for Research in African American Studies and the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia University, and especially the Department of Art and Archaeology. In many ways, this lecture is a little bit of a homecoming, but also a story about my research thus far. Let me share my screen here. I first saw artist WANGECHI Mutu's performance-based color video cutting from 2004 in art historian and curator Isolde Brielmeyer's course, Contemporary African Photography and Video at Barnard College during the spring of 2010. The video opens with a scenic view of a rural landscape. Above the horizon, the sky is a swirl of brilliant bluish purple, yellowish red, and hot white light. A long, narrow gray hilltop divides it from a foreshortened expanse of parched brown earth. The point of view is ground level. The fissures in the dirt are thickest in the foreground, and what looks like a fallen tree branch lies slightly off center of the frame. The crackling and hissing noise of the wind filled the air. In slow motion, the artist walks into view from left off screen. Mutu wears a red apron atop a white dress, her hair tied back with a handkerchief and her feet are bare. She wields a machete in her right hand and gently touches the earth with its tip, as if in blessing, before beginning to hack at the tree limb. She strikes from all directions, awkwardly bending and reaching high above her head as she throws each blow. Mutu's actions are fresh at first. She hits the fallen tree branch with so much force that debris flies around. Gradually, the time between blows lengthens as she tires. At one point, the machete sticks in the log and Mutu drags it with difficulty as she tries to extract the blade, finally using her foot as leverage in order to disengage. As the artist labors, the sound of the machete hitting the branch makes her breathing hard. She tires, then walks off screen right, up a hill incline with her hands on her lower back as if it aches. Contemporary considerations of cutting assume that the most significant intersection of self and place on view is a Black African woman hard laboring in a rural landscape. In doing so, they overlook a reading of Mutu creating the work as an artist in residence at Art Pace, and an audience engaging with the spatial and audiovisual dynamics of the projection. The reduction of cutting to, quote, a ritualized performance of unchecked savagery, end quote, demonstrates how placing the work into a contemporary African diaspora paradigm centered on the artist's social biography limited interpretations of the work and the artist. I seek to disturb, to borrow the words of Darby English, the, quote, untroubled legibility of cutting as representing the 1994 Rwandan genocide, for instance, and attend to all that remains unsaid in declarations such as, Mutu set the ritual in Texan landscape. It reflects both the immediate and historical dimensions of the lure of violence. The red clay hills of the Trans-Pecos region conjure a Kalahari-like atmosphere of primordial strivings, while its own recent history is etched with the equestrian arts of the vaquero, the Mexican wrangler, whose legacy was vampirized to fabricate the more palatable archetype of the Anglo cowboy. What if we think about Mutu as enacting otherness in cutting, as a performative strategy to counter how the overlapping tropes of the African artist as the nomad, the laborer, the uprooted victim, the hybrid cosmopolitan, and the transmigrant that was frequently found in contemporary art discourse in the US at the time. I want to think about how Mutu uses, how you two might be smelling blood, acting against while taking advantage of fixed narratives of how race, gender, and nationality inform US reception of her artistic practice as contemporary African diaspora art in the early 2000s. Rather than as a performance as a representation of others, Can we think of the artist as enacting the discourse of colonialism as a strategy to highlight and critique prevalent paradigms found at the time? I want to consider the video projection in relation to the bullet hole wall markings and dripping wine red bottles to envision how the sense of physical violence that emanates from the sight and sound of Mutu hacking and cutting touched upon the walls, spilled onto the floor, and pervaded the air of art space, an institution, San Antonio, Texas. So here I'm showing an installation view of Hanging in Texas from 2004-2005 at Art Pace in San Antonio, where WANGECHI MUTU was a resident. How may the discursive context and content of Mutu's early practice formed and contributed to the rise of the artist's career, while also limiting its critical reception? Can we think of Hanging in Texas as a political act of self-representation at a time when fixed and widely held ideas about the artist and her artwork proliferated? Indeed, her participation in the prestigious International Artist in Residence program at Art Pace in 2004 marked a noteworthy moment in her career. The artist mobilized, and in doing so, at the time, the artist mobilized cultural institutional capital during major paradigm shifts throughout the arts and humanities, becoming one of the most prominent international contemporary visual artists of the 21st century. I want to think about how Mutu immigrated to New York City in the early 90s in the wake of such exhibitions as Contemporary African Artists Changing Tradition at the Studio Museum in Harlem, 1990, as well as African Explorers, 20th Century African Art, curated by the Center for African Art and on view there, as well as New Museum of Contemporary Art. Both major exhibitions of contemporary African art traveled the country in the early 1990s. And at the time, this stimulated interest in artistic practices from the continent for a US audience that was more likely to visualize ancient wood masks and statues when thinking of African art. Also in the early 1990s, downtown New York witnessed a vibrant contemporary art scene showcasing work from Africa. One of the first gallery shows Mutu sees upon arriving in the city was painter Richard Onyango's presentation of large-scale oil on canvas paintings at Salvatore Alla Gallery on Broadway. That's in the center here. Earlier that same year, and just 4 blocks away, Scoto Agahoa opened Scoto Gallery, one of the first commercial exhibition spaces to specialize in the sale of contemporary African art in New York City on Prince Street. Also during this time, Mutu interned at the Museum for African Art, which had moved from its original Upper East Side location to Soho in 1993. Also, notably, in 1994, the curator Okwe Nwezor co-founded INGZ, Journal of Contemporary African Art, a Brooklyn-based biannual scholarly peer review magazine that introduced a new paradigm for practice in the field. And you can see here, this is the cover image on the left, and on the right, you have both the front and the back matter. And I love that both, that Scoto is listed both as a inspiration for the journal, and then also has this advertisement for his space on Prince Street. In an editorial published in this first issue, entitled Redrawing the Boundaries Towards a New African Art Discourse, Nwezor criticizes mainstream US art institutions for the bias that informs the exoticization and exclusion of contemporary African artists, especially calling out shows such as the encyclopedic African Explorers. And Nwezor warns African artists to accept neither, quote, the unwieldy yoke, unquote, of the marginalized and estranged other put forth by US curators and art critics, nor how postmodernism, quote unquote, whitewashed third world cultural strategies of pastiche, appropriation, and hybridity. He states, quote, increasingly, artists themselves, not just museum curators or critics, are beginning to understand the need to redefine the argument and the spaces conducive for this dialogic view of art productions through the interrogation of the suspect practice of museology and other art historical apparatuses. Mutu describes this time in her life in New York as full of dense experiences. And this is in a recollection that she posted from 2011, but we'll get there. Working as a slide archivist at Max Protech Gallery in Soho, she familiarized herself with the practices of represented artists such as Glenn Ligon, Marilyn Minter, and Judy Pfaff. Meanwhile, she studied anthropology, cultural studies, and fine art, first at the New School for Social Research, then Parsons School of Art and Design, before graduating from the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art in 1996 with a BFA in sculpture. Working with artists such as Fred Wilson, Mutu learned practical studio skills and significantly, quote, how to appreciate and make something that is unique and taps into the moment, end quote. This early 1990s moment to which Mutu refers is what my mentor and dissertation advisor, art historian Cherie Smith, calls the height and denouement of multiculturalism. The debates surrounding identity-based group exhibitions, like the 1993 Whitney Biennial, are echoed in the scholarship of anthropology, art history, cultural studies, museum studies at the time. Artists such as Wilson were making gallery museum installations centered on the role museums and curators play in constructing systems of knowledge. Mutu's work from this time shows the ways in which the artist resisted categorization early on in her career. Here's an image of one of the wearable sculptures that she would make, resembled on traditional African jewelry. In this color photograph from 1996, you see a Black woman posed against patterned red and brown fabric wearing untitled phallic neck brace. The soft material sewn and stuffed into bulbous forms hangs around her neck in an overlapping tight array, like a bunch of inflated Black bananas. The model's deadpan face belies one hand suggestively fondling the sculpture. This cheekiness towards stereotypical expectations of how the artist's Kenyan nationality intersects with her art practice is also evident in Untitled 1997. The mixed media sculpture resembles early 20th century Congo and Kisi power objects from Central Africa. Streaked dark brown material covers a Crown Royal whiskey bottle. Its distinctive embossed netting pattern glass formally matches the twine wrapped around the bottleneck. The twine extends and curves down, resembling a slightly drooping flower in a vase, or the head and neck of a flamingo with cowrie shell eyes. Mutu began making these sculptures after she felt pressured to make, quote unquote, African art in her studio classes. She recalls, quote, every critique I had in class always came back to the idea that I was from the African continent. So I quite irreverently began to make a lot of small, fake, old, dug up looking African objects. I used bottles, feathers, tar, and old umbrellas that I had around. In what Luce calls a pronounced moment, she participated in the exhibition Life's Little Necessities, installations by women in the 1990s, curated by art historian Kellie Jones. On display at the 1990s Johannesburg Biennial, which was directed by Nwezor, the show and the festival are inscribed within African diaspora discourse. In 2012, Stevenson Gallery in Cape Town presented the exhibition Trade Routes Over Time, the first installment of a project celebrating the 15th anniversary of the exhibition, the second and last Johannesburg Biennial. In an accompanying online publication, Mutu discusses what a pivotal moment participating in the biennial was for her artistic practice and career, as well as for her personally. She notes that she conceived of a hanging sculptural work made from old pillows that friends had given her that she sewed and decorated to look like body parts and organs, but that she never got to see the work installed due to issues with immigration. Here, I must also thank Kellie for directing me to Tiffany Barber and Angela Naimu's illustrated interview with that was published in 2016, in which you see here Silver Cup Body Part Series from 1997. And Mutu talks about how she would ask her friends for pillows. She would, quote, boil them in the hope to distress them a little, give them some new warmth, the skins feel. They're not this color quite, but they ended up as stains. And in fact, when you think about it, a pillow or anything you sleep on has all of your body, especially fluids, saliva, the tears, sweat, semen, dandruff. In boiling it, it had an awful smell, but in the end, they left beautiful, big marks, end quote. I want to think about how this multisensory approach that marks Mutu's early installation art expands the understanding of her practice beyond the categorization of what we consider contemporary African diaspora art at the time. Most notably, Mutu gained recognition at this time, not for sculpture or installation art, but for mixed media collage works on paper that she embedded with a massive references to issues of the moment, that is race, gender, post-colonialism, hybridity, in the show Africaine, a group exhibition featuring work that critiqued mainstream representations of the Black female body that the Studio Museum in Harlem in New York mounted in 2002. Here we see Mutu's collages, and still shot on the left, and then a detail from the right of her pinup series from 2001, 2002, which were deemed by art critics as by far the standout and one step above the rest. Here, we see a group of approximately 14 by 10 each mixed media collages on paper. Mutu used watercolor to paint naked or partially dressed maimed female figures adorned with hair and facial features cut from glossy magazines. Layered pigment is skillfully layered to create gradient skin tones that range from deep, almost black, brown to pale sienna. The severed limbs reference the Sierra Leone Civil War, a horrific armed conflict which left approximately 50,000 people dead and countless raped, orphaned, and brutalized by both rebel, quote unquote, and government soldiers, infamous for amputating the limbs of captured civilians. The severed limbs are also reminiscent of the atrocities Belgian colonialists committed in the present-day Democratic Republic of Congo during the 19th century. Mutu painted the figures seductively, posing topless, with their bloody stumps resting on wooden crutches or peg legs. This group of watercolor collages are the first group of strange hybrids that Mutu creates to address African politics and gender and sexuality. And around this time, Mutu's career is flourishing amidst the presence of contemporary African art exhibitions in New York, a plethora of them. By 2002, a New York Times art critic reviewing the exhibition, The Short Century, Independence and Liberation Movements in Africa from 1945 to 1944 on view at PS1, they write, quote, Africa, whatever it is everywhere. It's far more than just a continent. It's a global diaspora, an international culture and a metaphor with fantastical associations for the West. Gold, savages, darkest, deepest: liberation, devastation. Africa has long flowed in New York City's bloodstream, and a fresh infusion has just arrived. Significantly, while the pinup series catapulted Mutu into stardom in the global contemporary art world, the success of her work was at odds with how she felt as a Black woman artist in the US. Looking back a few years later, Mutu identifies the pinup series as, quote, the works that opened up the floodgates. That's where it really begins. In a magazine feature article. She participated at the same time in the Studio Museum in Harlem's highly competitive residency program. And Thelma Golden remembers that during that time, she became accustomed to running into art dealers in the museum lobby. At the same time, the artist discloses how Black women in the arts are still incredibly exotic. There's not that many of us, and there are often times when I walk into a museum to install an exhibition, and it takes a while for people to register that I might be the artist. We're not used to seeing women of color, especially Black women, in powerful positions in the art world. Indeed, around this time, born in Kenya may as well have been Mutu's first or last name. In 2003, several reviews in the New York Times introduced the artist first and foremost by her background, casting her as a diasporic African other before talking about her as, and only as, a collage artist. One reviewer introduces the artist, and it's very similarly to a visual analysis of this work, as, quote, born in Kenya, went to school in England, and now lives in New York. She brings strands of her own history together in collage images that combine bits and pieces cut from fashion magazines, natural history books, and abstract watercolor patterns to create a new species of half woman, half animal beings. And here we have one of Mutu's larger works from the time, Writing Death in My Sleep. Right around this time, Mutu goes to this, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I want to say that between showing at the Johannesburg Biennial and her first solo exhibitions in New York at the time, she goes on to have the show at the Studio Museum and then also to earn her MFA from Yale University. Between that and her 2004 show at ArtPace, she participates in something like 20 international biennials, group exhibitions, and other artist residencies. And then here we are at ArtPace. We see a photograph of her leading a mini session with 60 students from Lee High School. Discussing a suite of prints with Janet Floor from Hare and Hound Press. And here also in her studio with works in progress. So how do we make sense of the work for which she's so well known and then going to hanging in Texas? And I want to suggest that the type of typecasting that Mutu experienced is evident not only in the New York Times reviews, but also, for instance, in this archival material from her show at ArtPace. For each ArtPace residency, a national artist is chosen, an international artist, and a local artist. And here we see that Wangechi Mutu is the national artist, listed from New York, New York. And the first sentence reads, in recent years, Kenyan-born Wangechi Mutu, and it goes on. The other two artists do not have their nationality or any kind of descriptive material in their write-ups at all. I want to think about the way then Excuse me. I want to think about then cutting as a hypervisible performance-based strategy, one similar to that of excess flesh that American Studies scholar Nicole Fleetwood identifies in the contemporaneous photographic practices of other Black women artists at the time. I'm thinking about works such as Tracy Rose's Venus Bartman, which co-opts the over-representation of the Black female body as the epitomized, over-sexualized primitive other to whiteness in order to comment on those very overdetermined racist and sexist codes forced upon their bodies. So while Mutu's career is flourishing, I want to think about him when cutting. Mutu's attire openly confronts a voyeuristic desire to see the other naked, and how she manipulates the senses of hearing, touch, and smell to create a haptic and proprioceptive encounter that encourages consideration of our own bodies alongside that of the artist. Indeed, the interconnected dynamics of race, representation, colonialism, and imperialism that shape the art historical discussions of cutting and produce a dominant narrative of the performance-based video relies on notions of otherness. Could cutting then be seen as a cathartic exercise against the white cube, immersive to implicate the visitor, breaking open the space into the real world, echoing onto the walls of the gallery space? Contemporaneous critiques of cutting frame Mutu's repetitious, vigorous, and methodical hacking as an homage to the 1994 Rwandan genocide. And they perceive the violence not only in Mutu's movements, but also in the barren, ambiguous landscape that could be anywhere or more believable nowhere. Such imagery depends on past and present day colonialism and imperialism. Indeed, the language of 19th century European literature on Africa, a la Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness from 1899, is evoked in descriptions of Mutu's preliminary site visit to San Antonio as a, quote, exploratory visit embarked upon with trepidation. The imperial rhetoric continues. The curator talks about how, from the beginning of her process, Mutu was involved with confronting the psychic baggage that she brought to her first contact with Texas. The resulting installation, Hanging in Texas, can be seen as both the result of her research into the region and a growing understanding of the personal roots of her visceral aversion to violence. Mutu comes from Kenya, which was prior to its hard-won independence in 1964, one of the most glittering jewels in the British imperial crown, end quote. In addition, as Mutu filmed cutting on the border between Mexico and the United States, several critics bring up historic and contemporary US imperialism. Critics observe how Mutu's, quote, occupation of this land speaks of a particular history. In addition, there's a vague and geographically conflating connection made between the desert where cutting is filmed and the Kalahari, a semi-arid sandy savanna in Southern Africa. Could we think about the movements, Mutu's actions, self-fashioning and props then as a performance of the other? One of the ways in which Mutu performs this otherness really is by the repeatedly chopping wood, establishing this identity through a stylized repetition of acts, a la Judith Butler. In a mannered and non-realistic way, she cuts heavy, blunt blows. Her gestures are artificial, stilted, and over-elaborate. Indeed, they're theatrical in order to constitute the illusion of a fixed, Black, female, African, other self. Indeed, it is through the self-fashioning and props that Mutu reinforces this otherness. Cultural theorist Marcy R. McMahon argues that dress constructs rather than covers identity. In this sense, codes of dress communicate the relationship between a particular body, its lived experience, and the space it occupies. The term suggests an intersection of dress with bodily performance and the possibility of alternative or negotiated gendered and racialized ideologies. With her simple white dress, red apron, hair handkerchief, bare feet, and machete, Mutu evokes both the stereotypical mammy archetype of the antebellum Southern United States, as well as the look of agricultural labor in her home country of Kenya, where women perform the majority of yard work using machetes. The reception of this performance as authentic is evident in the description of Mutu's attire. To some, Mutu is dressed in the modern uniform of an urban nurse or technician. To others, she calls to mind the ubiquitous images of Black, African, and diasporic women engaged in physical labor, as well as, quote, propaganda that convinced agrarian people to pick up the panga, machete, and turn it against their neighbors in the 1994 Rwandan genocide. Emphasis is placed here on how the machete's role as a weapon of uprising, conflict, and murder is embodied in Mutu's prop. While the writings on cutting identify Mutu early on and often as the performer in the video, they deliberate on Mutu as artist in residence less frequently. Writings focus on the fact that Mutu performs in cutting, date back to the first published piece of writing on the work, narrating her figure herself, positioning herself as subject, and that she herself inhabits the work. Yet other reviews even say that artist appears as herself and uses her own body. Comparisons are made between the video and her collage practice, which fail to distinguish Mutu as a real person with her own artistic subjects and performances. Could Hanging in Texas then be about Mutu hanging in Texas on her artist in residency, performing for the camera as a Black woman artist from Nairobi, living and working in New York City, and participating in a prestigious artist residency in San Antonio? For Mutu especially, Texas serves as a metonym for the racism and warmongering of the US, which had just entered the Iraq War a year prior. In her proposal for Hanging in Texas, she stereotypes Texas as emblematic of all that is wrong with the United States. And she connects the local to the global in saying that she was, quote, overwhelmed by the prospect of being in a region that was the epitome of this mentality in the present day. The government of the United States has yet again found a means to convince its citizens that out there is a maleficent population of evildoers. I want to suggest that Mutu exploits distinctive features of the video medium to literally project through moving, illuminated image and sound the violence depicted in cutting outward into the gallery space. If we really think about cutting as a video projection centered along the back wall of the gallery space assigned for her end of residency show, we can see how the illuminated video abutted and reflected off the polished concrete floor of the gallery. As film scholar Kate Mudluck theorizes, this screen-based media installation proposes a new double spatial dynamic that suggests viewers as both here and there, now. By projecting cutting onto a gallery wall, Mutu foregrounds the screen as a performative category. By releasing the image from a monitor, the video becomes more physically engaged with the space itself. In doing so, she disrupts one of the main ways colonialism and imperialism constitute and fix the other. In other words, through photography, television, and movies. The rectangular color format of the video projection acts like a window that admits sound, light, and motion into the darkened front gallery of ArtPace and affords the audience a view that extends beyond its four walls. We not only see the filming location, but we get a sense of how it feels. Laura Marx theorizes this kind of visuality as haptic, a perception involving a combination of tactile, kinesthetic, and proprioceptive functions, the way that we can experience touch both on the surface of and inside our bodies. I'm thinking about how here in cutting, when we think about Hanging in Texas, we can sense a kind of vision that functions like a sense of touch, a sense that radiates out into the gallery space. Indeed, Marx's theory of haptic aesthetics, a quote, current of tactile epistemology, end quote, which stretches across various disciplines, proposes a tactile theory of vision related to mimesis and the index, in that it argues that images are produced not through imitation, but through a bodily contact between the viewer and that which is viewed, and that all the marks can then be seen as visible indexes of a tactile event. Here then, I want to suggest that the wall markings and the dripping wine bottles entitled Wall Roses and Wine Drip operate mimetically, with both imitating physical contact between the audience and the glass bottles, the dripped wine, and markings, as well as serving as visible indexes of mutu, draining the ceilings and scarring the walls of ArtPace. In a 2008 interview with art historian Isolde Perlmeyer, Mutu recalls that by hammering the gallery walls of ArtPace to make wall roses, she transformed the exhibition space into a huge skin surface. Her violent projectile scarring actions created circular cavities, which she then stained with red pigment. The bullet wounds fade in color from an intense purplish red in the center to pink around the circumference, imitating the deep centers and superficial edges characteristic of ballistic trauma. During the 2 months Hanging in Texas was on view at ArtPace, red wine slowly leaked from wine drip. Mutu used metal hardware to outfit almost 24 red wine bottles, which she then upended and hung throughout the space. The glass bottles quietly dripped red wine onto the gallery floors as if Mutu were slowly bleeding out the gallery. The leaking fluid created small puddles of scarlet-colored stains, resembling shallow pools of blood. Hanging upside down by thin wire hardware, the wine bottles look like intravenous blood bags. Rather than replace or purify the blood as through a blood transfusion or dialysis, however, Mutu accentuates the exhibition space. As the wine turned old and stale, Mutu described how the exhibition space felt and smelt more alive with each passing day. The scent went from rancid wine to a yeast and baking bread odor. She said that she wasn't thinking about a specific gender, but it did seem to feel somehow more female. I think this observation underscores intersections between politics of identity, representation, and the senses, to which considerations of Hanging Texas need to attend. Indeed, I'm saying that Mutu is taking advantage of stereotypes of primitive, violent Africans, as well as smell aversions that express deep-seated dislike towards women, immigrants, and the working class, to simulate an attack on the white cube. The hanging wine bottles and wall markings in Hanging in Texas flesh out the corporeality of cutting and encourage embodied audience perception. In a 2008 interview, the artist remembers that attributing corporal properties to the exhibition space enabled a cathartic release, a way of, quote, dealing with my own frustrations and feelings of confinement, end quote. The artist continued that her body became an extension of the mark-making tool. And she says, I began to create a permanent reminder of this inner rage that probably emanated from feeling uncomfortable as a foreigner in the United States in a time of war and xenophobia. I want to say that by treating the ceilings and walls of art paste like flesh, Mutu challenges the idea that the white cube of museum and gallery spaces are inherently and ideally devoid of bodies, let alone Black female foreign bodies like her own. The way that she evokes both touch and smell act like minefields that need to be physically and conceptually navigated in order to see cutting in its fullness and see the ways that it functions as both a curtain and a backstage. Mutu goes on to incorporate the hanging wine bottle element in exhibition installations like An Exhuming Gluttony, A Lover's Requiem, on view at Salon 94 in New York during the summer of 2006. In this instance, we see soft fur pelts, sticky brown packing tape, and bulky felt moving blankets, engaging the sense of touch and performance-based video projection, enveloping the viewer in sound, light, and motion. A year later, in 2007, she continues to explore what she herself calls an obsession with ink, solvents, liquids, and their associations with elements like blood, saliva, milk, tears, sweat, and urine. And you may remember that list of wonderful liquids from thinking about the pillows that she did in Johannesburg, so 10 years prior. Here in the mixed media installation, Will Honey Flavored Milk Soften That Peg Fed Rage, on view in 2007 at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, Mutu fills upended suspended glass bottles with fresh milk instead of red wine, which imbued the gallery space with a musky, milky smell. As the suspended wine bottle and wall marking elements of hanging Texas bring art paste to life through the simulation of bleeding, wounded flesh, the leaking milk bottles transform the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver into a nourishing body. This ambivalence seems to somehow relate to Mutu's experience as an artist born in Nairobi, living and working in the United States. Not only was her work confined to a grand narrative of African art due to issues with her immigration status, she was trapped in the United States for over a decade. If she had traveled overseas during that time, she would not have been able to re-enter the country as she had chosen to be her home. Stuck in the United States, she relied on assistants to install her international exhibitions. And she says the process of installing her solo shows was so bizarre, quote, like a combination of being paralyzed and blind. Perhaps this restriction is another reason for the corporal materiality of these early mixed media installations. That through a strategic use of the senses of touch and smell and sight and sound, Mutu was able to challenge conceptions of the museum or gallery space as fixed and unbearing, resist curatorial master narratives, and grant primacy to experiencing the body, the artwork, the audience, and each other as a multisensorial encounter. And I just want to end here with a beautiful view of her most recent installation at the Gladstone Gallery. And some of you may have seen it, and something that you cannot tell from this photo is that the water was pumped in, so you could hear a pump, the sound of a pump, and you could also see the water rippling, and it was a pretty amazing experience. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you, Uchenna. What a great talk. Love that work, and I love that last slide. Of course, that show that's pretty amazing. So I encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A for all of you who do have questions, and let us know what you're thinking. But I will start with my own question, which is, well, I have so many, but let's start with this. So do you see the Art Pace show as a kind of turning point in her work? Because is this the first time she travels, to another part of the United States to spend a long amount of time? I mean, she's in New York, you described it, in the, early 90s, in the 90s, there's a lot of stuff going on. You're mentioning Okwe and Enka and all that. And, Fred Wilson is doing his thing. Lorna Simpson is, doing hers. There's a lot of activity around that time with Black artists. And particularly in New York, you have the Studio Museum, you have Thelma then at the Studio Museum, not at the Studio Museum, I'm sorry, at the Whitney Museum doing her shows. So there's a lot of kind of new activity of the 90s that she's kind of, I would say, embraced by or learning from or in community with. And then she goes to Art Pace, as you said, this very prestigious residency. And is this the turn in her work, do you think, that particular encounter?
I do think it was, and I'm going to backtrack too and say that the community, of course, involved you as well, Kellie, and that I do think that this moment in 2004 does mark a turning point, especially because this is the first instance that she's doing the hammering and the dripping fluids. At the same time, actually, a few weeks before her show opens at Art Pace, she has an installation called Hanging In at the Whitney Museum's Philip Atria space. So she's doing this in two spaces. And I think that it marks a new period of experimentation. And then also perhaps a moment in her career where she felt she had the freedom to experiment and move away from the work that had not only garnered her this acclaim, and to be also more practical about it, was super successful in the market and have an opportunity to try something else and do something else outside of the box.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often wonder, I mean, and then she stops them, right? She goes and does these for quite some time. You know better than I do how long she does them, but they're quite labor intensive. And, pounding those walls and all that kind of stuff, and the wine. And then she kind of stops it. But I'm always interested in why, Wangechi Mutu is as much a sculptor in many ways as she was, involved with two-dimensional work. Is it just more of the market choosing to focus on those, or is there another reason that you feel that this work has been overlooked, or her sculptural aspect up to this point has been pretty kind of sublimated in many ways?
I think that in a lot of ways, the two-dimensional work may have been more, even in its creativity and ingenuity, more recognizable to audiences. Mostly, I would say, art critics who were keen to repeat, that description that I gave of both what Mutu was doing and stereotypes of Africa seemed to be one and the same. And that I think that it made sense in a lot of ways to categorize her work as, and this is not to say that this is not true. This is an and conversation that that she's pulling in all these references from colonial East Africa. And I want to bring up that also, the fact that she's from Kenya at a time when Nigerians and South Africans predominantly maybe monopolized the African diaspora discourse. So I think that was part of it too, you know, and then also that she's a woman, because the shows such as Contemporary African Artists, Changing Tradition, and then also Africa Explores, those were all shows that were super male heavy, painting heavy, photography. And that was really the moment, you know, that she says, that other art historians say this was the moment. And so I think that the medium that she chose worked well in the narrative. And yeah. And she did, and she works it so skillfully.
Yeah, she's just an amazing artist in all mediums, I think.
Yes.
There is a question here from Professor Lisa Trevor. Thank you. She says, thank you, Dr. Itam. Such an interesting paper. I was wondering, do you see Wangechi Mutu's installation as in dialogue with Ena Mendieta's earlier body earth artworks and her narratives of being a Cuban woman in the US? Or are the similarities that one might see just superficial? Thank you, Professor Trevor.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Trevor. I appreciate that question, and thank you for listening to the talk. I do see similarities both with Mutu's practice and Mendieta's silhouettes, as well as with, say, thinking about even earlier feminist performance works, such as Yoko Ono, and thinking about Yoko Ono's cut piece. So here we have both two transnational figures working in the US who garner a lot of attention based on their bodies. And then that again is also the moment, right, of feminist performance art and using the body. And I think that that comparison between Mutu's video and, say, Ono's cut piece and Mendieta's silhouette pieces is that in both instances you have, in these three scenarios, you can think about the body in all these different kind of ways, right? Like being disrobed, and then we have missing, but presence, the palpable, the palimpsest of the body. And then with Mutu, then we have the body, we have her body, but it's not her, right? Yeah.
The other question I have, and please send your questions, we're looking for your questions, is based on something we were talking about before we went live here, which was you are an expert in the art of the United States. And I said, is this what you want to say? Do you want to say African diaspora? And you had leave the United States. And I'd love for you to elucidate that a little bit more.
Sure. And I have to say that I am working through this. So I also welcome questions and a dialogue about it. And the audience may notice that I titled the talk, Smell Bud on Wangechi Mutu and Global Contemporary Art. And then as I was preparing the presentation, I thought to myself, I think I was trying something new here, and what would happen if I took out the African diaspora? Would that present us with a different framework with which to think about her practice? And you may notice through the lecture, did a little sprinkling of, you know, global contemporary and international and of the US. And it's messy maybe, right? And it's hard to pinpoint, it's hard to make really neat. And by saying that I look at modern and contemporary art of the US, in the US, it allows me to think about a geography with a little bit of wiggle room, because obviously the United States is of the African diaspora, is it not, right? And so I want to think about that.
Okay, wow, that's okay. The United States is of the African diaspora. Okay, I like it where you're taking this. So we would think, you know, as you described, you know, she's attacking the white cube. It's also the United States. Is she maybe making her mark as a diasporic person? I mean, is that also another way we can think about that, given, you know, your kind of definition here of art of the United States as also part of the diaspora, putting it that way?
Yes, I think she puts it the best when she says that, and as you were saying about it being really labor intensive, I remember reading accounts where she was saying that she was starting to hurt herself, her fingers with the hammering and everything. And I think that, and here, this is where it gets tricky again, right? This is all about working, right? A lot about labor. And she's doing this labor and she's doing this work in Texas, right? In the case of hanging in Texas. And so I want to think about that more and think about the fact that if we have an artist who's been based in the US, who's making art in the US, what happens with the category? Where should it go? In front of her, in front of the practice, in front of both? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to say though that I think we need it still in the field. It's yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about the video? A lot of the critical writing on that video, and again, most of the writing, as we know, on Mutu is about the collages. I mean, there's such a large body of work. I imagine that there'll be more writing on sculpture now that she's making these incredible things. But the reception of the video has always been about labor, about women, about this kind of solo actor, usually Mutu, performing hard labor. Can you say a little bit more about where you see the video practice fitting in and the kind of what it addresses, the kind of critical intervention the video itself makes?
Yes, I think I want to think about labor in various ways because I want to think of laborers. So in that way, I'm thinking about Mutu in the performance-based video, the basis of that video being labor and a performance of labor, but then also thinking about cutting as the result of artistic labor. And so I'm really trying to tease out and ask us to think about Mutu in the video as not as herself or as a caricature of herself, but as an artist making a video while she's on a residency in the US, and what that was like for her. And if we can put those two layers together, right? Because also I think that her collage work, obviously, all of her work must be laborious in all the ways that we can think about work, right? And like not only actually physical work, but also thinking about the mental work, emotional work, conceptual work, everything, every work matters, right? And so I think that sometimes the emphasis on her actual actions in cutting have more to do, I think, with reading it in terms of images that one might see in media, on television or in newspapers, especially in the early 2000s. And I think that's important, but I also think that it's important to really think about her as an artist and making videos. And
as her video practice develops, and maybe this is a little slightly out of bounds of the talk itself, but do you see this as just kind of the germinating thing that gets her more into this idea of labor, this idea of that kind of aspect of the sensory, or that kind of aspect of production? Do you see this as just a jumping off point for the rest of the video work that she does? Does it have the same aesthetics, or do you see her moving out? In other words, with the sculpture itself, if we look at those early sculptures that she showed where she's pretending to make what she thinks people will see as African art, right? And then moves into, a different kind of sculptural practice. Do you see this happening with the video? In other words, this is just kind of like an initial, position perhaps in this work.
That's a really good question. And I'm thinking, because right now I'm thinking about, for instance, earlier video pieces such as Amazing Grace, or what was that amazing one? And I'm sure maybe you know it better than I do, Magic, where she's, and then I'm thinking about Eat Cake. And
And especially in terms of your sensory, how they kind of build on not just labor, but also the kind of the sensory piece. I'm just wondering if you see this as some kind of early kind of paradigmatic thing, or perhaps not.
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm gonna have to think about that. I'm gonna have to think about that. It's funny because when I first started writing about Mutu, I wrote only about cutting, and I would frame it with her videos, but not as part of Hanging in Texas. And then I went down the Hanging in Texas
right
rabbit hole.
Right.
Yeah, got a little fixated. But you've given me a lot to think about, and I want to talk to you about it more.
Okay, we'll get back to it. And I think I'll just ask one more thing. Similarly, how do you feel the new work you showed, that last slide, and these new, bronze, some of them very kind of monumental, the pieces for the Metropolitan that were on view for a while. How do you think those fit in or signal where her work is going at this time?
I think monumental is the perfect word, right? That I think that the sculptural vocabulary seems to be lending itself more in terms of permanence, and with the large scale, with the bronze, but also I think the most amazing, daring leap into other ways of thinking about our world, cosmology, our history, our traditions, and this is the word I guess they used to say, folklore. But I'm thinking about ways of thinking, ways of world formation, which I think is amazing to see, in places like the front of the Met.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for joining us, and thank you for joining us at Columbia this semester. Uchenna Itam is, of course, teaching a course for art history and archaeology and African-American and African diaspora studies called Identity and the Senses in Contemporary Art, graduate seminar. So we want to thank you for that. And we also want to, celebrate you as being University of Pennsylvania pre-doctoral fellow for excellence in diversity. So we want to, congratulate you on that too. And
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you.
For this evening and this great talk.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much.